My name is Clara Ashworth, and I am now, at the age of 65, what you might call a professional cartographer, a consultant whose maps have guided the placement of railways and roadways across half the country. But that is the end of the story, and the end is never as interesting as the beginning. The beginning found me at 45, a spinster living in my ancestral home, a woman whose life's passion was considered little more than an unladylike and eccentric waste of time. My family loved me, I suppose, in the way one loves a piece of familiar, if slightly odd, furniture. They thought my maps were a silly hobby, a collection of meaningless doodles I created in my dusty upstairs room. They never imagined that those very doodles, those precise lines and careful notations, would one day be the only thing standing between our family and absolute ruin. It's funny how the things people dismiss in you can become your greatest strengths. What they called my obsession became our salvation, and in the process it taught me that the sweetest vindication isn't about proving others wrong, but about finally proving to yourself that you were right all along. Before I tell you how a forgotten king's charter and the ghost of a long-dead oak tree saved our home from the iron fist of progress, I'd love it if you'd let me know where in the world you're watching from today. It always fascinates me to see how far these stories travel, and if you've ever had a passion that others didn't understand, go ahead and hit that like button. For those of you who are new here, please consider subscribing to join our community of people who know that there's more to a story than what you see on the surface. Our home, Blackwood Manor, was not a grand estate of storybook proportions, but a solid gray stone house that had settled into the landscape of the county like a sleeping animal. It had belonged to the Ashworths for nearly 300 years, its stones holding the echoes of our family's births, deaths, and quiet dramas. My world, however, was contained within a single room on the second floor. It was once my nursery, then my bedroom, and had, over the past 20 years, transformed into what my brother Thomas derisively called my map room. He wasn't wrong. The walls were covered in them. There were ordnance surveys, tithe maps from the local parish, and hand-drawn geological charts I'd made myself. The air smelled perpetually of old paper, India ink, and the faint waxy scent of the candles I burned late into the night. My large oak drafting table, stained with the ghosts of 1,000 ink spills, was my sanctuary. There, with my rulers, my compasses, and my pens, I could create order from chaos. I could understand the world, not through the messy and unpredictable filter of human emotion, but through the elegant, irrefutable logic of contour lines, gradients, and boundaries. Topography was a language that never lied. A river carved its path according to the laws of physics, not whim. A hill stood where it stood for reasons of ancient geological force, not social standing. In my map room I had control, I had a purpose that felt real and tangible, a stark contrast to the life prescribed for a woman of my station, which seemed to consist mainly of embroidery, managing the household accounts, and waiting. This quiet, ordered existence was often punctuated by the well-meaning but wearying dismissiveness of my family. My father, William Ashworth, was a man carved from the same stubborn stone as our house. He was a creature of tradition and propriety, and he viewed my cartography as a baffling, slightly embarrassing hobby, like a grown woman still playing with dolls. He could not comprehend why I would choose to spend my hours hunched over a table making what he called scrawls, when I could be engaging in more suitable, ladylike pastimes. My older brother Thomas was a younger, more restless version of our father. He was pragmatic, concerned with crop yields, tenant disputes, and the price of livestock at market. To him, my maps were utterly useless, an intellectual folly with no practical application. He would often burst into my room without knocking, using my precious table to rest his muddy boots or conduct a loud conversation about estate matters, completely oblivious to the delicate work he was disrupting. A typical evening at Blackwood Manor served as a perfect illustration of my place within the family. We were seated around the heavy oak dining table, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows on the dark wood paneling. Father was at the head of the table, carving the roast with a grim sense of ceremony. Thomas was talking about the need to repair the western fences before the autumn rains set in. I had spent the afternoon charting the subtle shifts in the course of Winding Creek at the edge of our property, and I was excited by a small discovery. "Father," I began, waiting for a pause in Thomas's monologue about fence posts. I was looking at the old parish maps from the last century. It's fascinating. The creek's oxbow has migrated nearly 50 feet to the south since the 1780 survey was done. If that rate of erosion continues, we could lose a significant portion of the lower pasture within our lifetime. I spoke with the quiet passion of someone sharing a secret of the earth itself. My father paused his carving, a sliver of beef held aloft on the fork. He sighed, a sound of profound parental exhaustion. "Clara, please," he said, not unkindly but with a tone that instantly deflated me. "No one is interested in your doodles at the dinner table. We're discussing practical matters." Thomas chuckled, wiping his mouth with his napkin. "Still playing with crayons, sister? 50 feet in 100 years? I think the fences are a bit more pressing, don't you?" He looked at Father for confirmation, and Father gave a slight, affirming nod. The subject was closed. My discovery, a small but significant piece of the story of our land, was dismissed as a child's fanciful observation. I felt the familiar hot blush of shame creep up my neck. I looked down at my plate, my appetite gone. It wasn't their cruelty that hurt. It was their utter, unbreachable incomprehension. They didn't see the beauty or the utility in it. They saw only a pointless obsession, a character flaw in a daughter and sister who had already failed in her primary duty of finding a husband and securing the family's social standing. I remembered with a sudden pang a day when I was 16. I had spent a month creating a meticulously detailed map of the entire Blackwood estate, noting every ancient tree, every spring, every crumbling stone wall. I presented it to my father as a birthday gift, my heart hammering with nervous pride. He had glanced at it for a moment, murmured, "Very nice, dear," and then set it aside to praise Thomas for winning a local shooting competition. I later found the map in a dusty corner of the library, a ring stain from his brandy glass marring the carefully drawn compass rose. That was the day I learned that my work was for me alone. It was a private language that no one else in this house cared to learn. My mother had been the only one who seemed to understand. She would come into my room and watch me work, her hands still, her presence a quiet blanket of acceptance. She never praised my skill, but she would ask questions. "Why does that line curve so?" she'd ask, pointing a delicate finger at a contour line, and I would explain, and she would nod, a small, thoughtful smile on her face. But she had been gone for 10 years now, and with her, that last vestige of quiet validation. So I would retreat, after dinner, while Father read his newspaper and Thomas smoked his pipe. I would slip away back to my sanctuary. I would light the candles, the familiar scent of ink and paper, a balm to my wounded spirit. Here the lines on the paper did not judge. The slope of a hill didn't find my interests peculiar. The curve of a river didn't wish I were more concerned with social calls. Here I was not the eccentric spinster Miss Ashworth. I was a cartographer. I was an explorer of stationary worlds, and for a time that was enough. The letter that shattered our world arrived on a Tuesday. It was a crisp, formal-looking envelope bearing the imposing crest of the Great Midland Railway. It was addressed to my father. He read it at the breakfast table, his face slowly draining of color, turning the shade of old parchment. Without a word, he handed it to Thomas. I watched my brother's eyes scan the page, his usual confident expression hardening into a mask of disbelief and anger. "What is it?" I asked, my voice small in the heavy silence. Thomas threw the letter down on the table. "Thorne," he said, "the name a curse. It's Silas Thorne and his blasted railway. They're planning a new line from the capital to the northern industrial cities." He stabbed a finger at the letter. "And the route, it comes straight through Blackwood." My blood ran cold. I picked up the letter. The language was cold, legalistic, but the enclosed map was brutally clear. A thick, uncompromising red line sliced through the heart of our land. It cut across the South Meadows, the best grazing land we had, and would pass less than 300 yards from the house itself, requiring a great viaduct to be built across the valley of the winding creek. The thought of it was a physical violation, the noise, the smoke, the constant rumble of locomotives shaking the very foundations of our 300-year-old home. My father, who had been sitting in stunned silence, finally found his voice. It was a roar of impotent fury. "They can't do this," he bellowed, slamming his fist on the table, making the teacups jump. "This land has been in our family for generations. I will not have it desecrated by some smoke-belching machine for the profit of a soulless industrialist." Thomas, ever the pragmatist, was already thinking several steps ahead. "Father, this is Thorne's railway. You know his reputation. He gets what he wants. He has friends in Parliament, in every ministry." The name Silas Thorne was spoken in the county with a mixture of awe and fear. He was a force of nature, a man who saw the country not as a patchwork of homes and histories, but as a map of obstacles to be conquered by iron and steam. His ambition was legendary, his methods ruthless. We immediately summoned Mr. Peters, our family solicitor for over 30 years. He was a small, neat man with a perpetually worried expression, but he was known for being thorough and competent. He arrived that afternoon, his brow furrowed as he examined the railway's documents. He exuded an air of professional calm that was, for a time, reassuring. "This is an outrage, William, an absolute outrage," he clucked, shaking his head. "To run a line so close to a historical property, it's vandalism. But don't you worry, we will fight this. We'll file an injunction. We'll appeal on the grounds of disruption, of the destruction of valuable agricultural land, of the depreciation of the property's value. We have strong arguments. They may have Parliament on their side, but even Parliament must listen to reason and precedent." His confidence was a small spark of hope in the gathering gloom. My father clung to it, his anger coalescing into a determined resolve. Thomas was more skeptical, but even he seemed to believe that the sheer audacity of the railway's plan might be its undoing. I, however, felt a different kind of unease. While they talked of legal strategy and monetary value, I was staring at the preliminary survey map that had been included with the letter. It was a clean, professionally drafted document, but something about it felt wrong. The lines were too neat, too simple. They depicted our land as a series of simple geometric shapes, ignoring the subtle complexities I knew were there. The boundary line along the winding creek in particular was drawn as a perfectly straight vector, but I knew that was not the true shape of the boundary. I knew it followed the meander of the water. It was a small detail, perhaps insignificant, but it was an error, and it planted a tiny seed of an idea in my mind, a thought so fragile and uncertain that I dared not give it voice. Not yet. The weeks that followed were a slow-motion nightmare. The initial optimism curdled into anxious waiting, then into gnawing dread. Mr. Peters bustled back and forth from the county town, his briefcase filled with affidavits and legal arguments. He was confident, then concerned, then finally utterly defeated. He arrived one rain-swept evening, looking older and smaller than I'd ever seen him. He sank into an armchair by the fire, dripping water onto the Persian rug, and delivered the verdict. "It's no use," he said, his voice a weary rasp. "They have a parliamentary act sanctioning this line. It gives them powers of compulsory purchase, what some are calling eminent domain. They can take the land and the courts can do nothing to stop them." He explained the legal labyrinth. Thorne's lawyers had anticipated every objection. They had precedents for every argument. They had the full weight of industrial progress and national interest behind them. An ancient family's attachment to their land was, in the eyes of this new, relentless law, nothing more than sentiment. They've made a final offer of compensation. Mr. Peters continued, pulling a document from his case. It's an insult. It wouldn't even cover the cost of relocating the tenant farms, let alone compensate for the loss of the manor's value. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the room. My father seemed to shrink in his chair, the fight draining out of him completely, leaving behind a brittle, hollow shell. Thomas stood by the window, his back to us, his shoulders rigid with suppressed rage. The finality of it was crushing. It was over. We had lost. In that moment of complete despair, the tiny seed of an idea in my mind began to sprout. I found myself speaking, my voice trembling slightly but clear in the quiet room. "Mr. Peters," I said, "did you check the original land grants? The Royal Charter of 1685? All three men turned to look at me as if I had suddenly started speaking in a foreign tongue. Mr. Peters blinked, his expression a mixture of pity and annoyance. "Miss Ashworth," he said, with the strained patience one uses for a difficult child, "with all due respect, a dusty piece of parchment from the Stuart era is not going to stop a locomotive. We are dealing with modern industrial law, with acts of Parliament. Ancient history has no bearing here." My father, his face a mask of mortification, made a sharp, cutting gesture with his hand. "Clara, that is enough," he commanded, his voice raw with grief and shame. "This is not the time for your fantasies. Can't you see we are facing ruin? The public humiliation was a physical blow. To be dismissed so completely, so contemptuously in our darkest hour, was almost more than I could bear. I felt my cheeks burn, and I lowered my eyes, biting my lip to keep from crying out. But beneath the hurt, something else was kindling, a stubborn, defiant anger. They were wrong. They were all wrong. They saw history as a fantasy, a collection of irrelevant stories. But I knew better. I knew that the land remembers. The land holds its own history, written in stone and water and ancient boundaries, and I was perhaps the only person left who knew how to read it. That night, as the rest of the house lay in a stupor of defeat, I went to my room, locked the door, and began to work. My hobby was about to become our only weapon. My map room became a fortress against the despair that had settled over the rest of the house. While my father wandered the halls like a ghost and Thomas drank heavily in the study, I worked with a feverish, focused intensity I had never known before. This was no longer a pleasant pastime, it was a battle, and my weapons were vellum, ink, and the accumulated knowledge of a lifetime. I was fueled by decades of quiet frustration, by every dismissive word, every patronizing smile. They thought my work was a fantasy. I would show them the unyielding power of a well-documented fact. I started with the family archives, a collection of tin boxes stored in a damp cellar room. I pulled out the oldest, most fragile documents, my fingers gentle on the brittle paper. There it was, a copy of the Charter of 1685, granted to my ancestor Jonathan Ashworth by King James II. The calligraphy was ornate, the language a thicket of archaic legal terms. But the core of it was a description of the land's boundaries. I spread it carefully on my drafting table, the parchment crackling in protest. The key passage was a description of the southern boundary, the very one the railway intended to follow. It read, "Thence from the great bend of the winding creek due south to the heart of the King's Oak, and from there eastward along the old ridgeline, the King's Oak." The name resonated with me. It was a figure of family legend, a colossal ancient oak tree that had stood as a landmark for centuries. According to the stories, it had been struck by lightning in the time of my great-grandfather, and all that remained was a mossy stump, now long since rotted away to nothing. The railway's surveyors, using their modern instruments and their forward-looking gaze, had no knowledge of a tree that hadn't existed for over 100 years. They had seen the first clause, "from the great bend of the winding creek," and had simply drawn a straight line southward, following what they assumed was the intent of the deed. It was logical, it was efficient, and I was becoming more and more certain that it was legally, fundamentally wrong. A boundary marker, even a vanished one, was not a suggestion, it was a legal fact. The problem was proving where the tree had stood, without its precise location. My theory was nothing more than speculation. I spent the next several days poring over every map in my collection. I traced, I measured, I converted old units of measurement, chains, links, rods into modern feet and yards. The work was painstaking. My back ached, my eyes burned from the candlelight, and my fingers were permanently stained with ink. I found hints and clues. A 1720 estate ledger mentioned the pasture under the oak. A hand-drawn map from a tenant dispute in the 1760s showed a crude symbol for a large tree in roughly the right area, but I needed something definitive, something that would stand up to the scrutiny of hostile lawyers and engineers. My search led me beyond our own archives. I remembered hearing tales of a vast collection of county records stored in the old Shire Hall in the county town, a place few had reason to visit anymore. The next morning, I harnessed the pony to the trap myself, a task I hadn't performed in years. I told my father I was going to town for supplies. I didn't dare tell him the truth for fear of another soul-crushing dismissal. The county records office was even more neglected than I had imagined. It was a single cavernous room in the basement of the Shire Hall, smelling of damp and decay. A stooped elderly clerk with spectacles perched on the end of his nose looked up from his desk in surprise, as if I were the first visitor he'd had in a decade. "I am looking for old parish maps," I explained, "specifically tithe maps from the 18th century for the Blackwood area." He grunted, shuffled over to a towering wall of wooden drawers, and after a great deal of effort pulled one out. It was filled with rolled parchments tied with faded red ribbon. "Help yourself," he mumbled, and returned to his newspaper. For hours I sat at a dusty table, carefully unrolling one fragile map after another. The parchment was so brittle it threatened to turn to dust in my hands. The ink was faded, the handwriting of the old surveyors barely legible. It was frustrating, dispiriting work. Just as I was about to give up, my eyes raw and my spirit flagging, I found it. It was a tithe map from 1750, a document created to assess taxes on every field and cottage in the parish. And there, on the border of the Ashworth property, was a perfectly clear, beautifully rendered drawing of a massive oak tree. It was labeled in elegant script, "The King's Oak." And more importantly, the map was drawn to a precise scale and marked with reference points that still existed: the corner of a stone wall, the location of a particular bend in the creek, the old stone stile that led to the upper fields. My heart began to hammer in my chest. This was it. This was the proof. This map, combined with my own modern measurements, would allow me to triangulate the exact, legally binding location of that long-dead tree. Armed with this new information, I knew I had to go into the fields myself. I unearthed a simple theodolite from a trunk in the attic, a brass instrument that had belonged to my grandfather, who had been a keen amateur surveyor. It was heavy and unwieldy, but I cleaned it, calibrated it as best I could, and the next morning I set out. A woman of my age and class, alone in a field with surveying equipment, was a sight so unusual as to be scandalous. The tenant farmers stopped their work to stare, their expressions a mixture of confusion and amusement. I ignored them, my focus absolute. I set up the theodolite near the old stone stile, just as the railway's survey crews were packing up for the day. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man with a tired, intelligent face, strode over to me. His boots were caked in mud, and his expression was one of weary impatience. This, I would later learn, was Mr. Harrison, the railway's chief engineer. "Ma'am," he said, his voice curt but not unkind, "if you have a grievance with the railway, you can take it up with our legal department in the city. We're just doing our job out here." He clearly mistook me for another hysterical landowner, there to protest or plead. "I have no grievance, sir," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I have a question about your survey. What datum points did you use for the southern boundary line?" He gave a short, incredulous laugh. "Ma'am, I can assure you our surveys are perfectly accurate, conducted with the most modern equipment available. Good day." He tipped his hat perfunctorily and turned his back on me, striding away to organize his men. The dismissal was so swift, so absolute. It was a professional's dismissal of an amateur, a man's dismissal of a meddling woman. It was different from my family's, yet it stung just as sharply. But as I watched him go, I felt a flicker of grim satisfaction. Your modern equipment, I thought, can't see a ghost. I spent the rest of the day taking my measurements, meticulously recording my findings in a small notebook. I worked until the sun began to set, casting long golden fingers of light across the valley. Back in my room that night, the rest of the house asleep, I performed the final calculations. I drew the reference lines from the stone stile and the creek bend on a fresh sheet of paper. I used the scale from the 1750 map and my own measurements. And then, with a trembling hand, I marked the spot where the 3 lines intersected. The ghost of the King's Oak now had a precise location on a modern map. I then drew the true boundary line, as described in the ancient charter, from the creek to the heart of the oak. It was not a straight line, it bowed outward, creating a gentle crescent-shaped curve that encompassed the place where the great tree's root system would have spread. It was a subtle deviation, no more than 20 yards at its widest point, but it was everything. I took out the railway's survey map, and using a lamp to backlight the paper, I overlaid my own drawing. My breath caught in my throat. The crescent-shaped sliver of land, the piece that belonged unquestionably to Blackwood Manor according to the 1685 charter, was small, but it was not insignificant, for right in the middle of that sliver of land, marked on the railway's plans with a bold, confident X, was the designated location for the primary support pier of the new viaduct. The keystone of their entire bridge, the very foundation upon which their iron road would cross the valley, was planned for a piece of ground that they had no legal right to touch. Without that pier, their bridge could not be built as designed. Their route was unworkable. I leaned back in my chair, the pen falling from my ink-stained fingers. A profound, bone-deep silence filled the room. The house was quiet. The world was quiet. But in my head, a triumphant roar was building. I had found it. I had them. The day of the final signing was a somber affair. A cold, persistent drizzle fell from a pewter-gray sky, weeping down the window panes of the drawing room. My father had put on his best suit, but it hung on his diminished frame, making him look like a scarecrow dressed for a funeral. Thomas stood beside him, his jaw tight, his hands clenched into fists. They were preparing to surrender. The railway's representatives arrived precisely at 10 o'clock. There were 2 lawyers, men with sharp suits and even sharper eyes, and between them Mr. Harrison, the chief engineer. He looked uncomfortable in the formal setting, a man of fields and figures forced into a drawing room negotiation. He nodded curtly at my father and then stood by the window, staring out at the rain-swept valley his bridge was meant to conquer. The head lawyer, a man named Finch, spread the documents on the polished mahogany table with a quiet finality. "Mr. Ashworth," he began, his voice smooth and devoid of any real sympathy, "this is the final compulsory purchase order, along with the transfer of funds. If you would be so good as to sign here." He pushed a heavy leather-bound folder and a fountain pen across the table. My father stared at the document as if it were a coiled snake. He reached out a trembling hand, his face a mask of defeat. This was the moment our history ended, the moment 300 years of legacy was signed away for a pittance. And that was the moment I chose to enter. I had not dressed for a funeral. I had dressed for battle. I wore my most severe, practical dress, my hair pinned up tightly. In my hands I carried a large leather portfolio containing my maps. The 4 men in the room turned to look at me. My father's expression was one of pure horror. "Clara, not now," he hissed, his voice a desperate whisper. "For God's sake, have you no decency?" Thomas moved towards me, his intention clear. He was going to physically remove me from the room. "Sister, please," he begged, his eyes pleading with me not to make this awful day any worse. I ignored them both. I walked directly to the mahogany table and placed my portfolio upon it, right next to their legal documents. I looked directly at Mr. Finch. "Gentlemen," I said, my voice as steady and calm as I could make it, "I believe you have made a significant error in your survey. Mr. Finch and his colleague exchanged a look of amused condescension. "Miss Ashworth," he said, the title dripping with patronage, "I assure you the Great Midland Railway does not make errors of this nature. Now, if you would please allow your father—" I did not let him finish. I untied the leather straps of my portfolio and, with a smooth, practiced motion, unrolled my first map onto the table. It was a perfect hand-drawn copy of their own survey, the red line of the proposed railway like a scar across the landscape. "This is your plan," I stated simply. The lawyers sighed, and Mr. Harrison, who had turned from the window, watched me with a look of professional curiosity, a flicker of recognition in his eyes from our brief encounter in the field. Then I unrolled a second sheet, a piece of translucent vellum on which I had traced the 1750 tithe map. I carefully placed it directly over the first map. The features lined up perfectly, and this, I said, my voice gaining strength, is the legal parish record of the property boundaries from 200 years ago. I pointed with a steady finger. As you can see, it clearly indicates a significant landmark here, the King's Oak. Finally, I unrolled my third and largest map, my own comprehensive survey of the area. I laid it over the other two. It was a work of art, a culmination of all my years of study. It showed my triangulation calculations, the precise coordinates derived from the existing landmarks, and the resulting true boundary line. The crescent-shaped deviation was clearly marked in a different color ink. The Charter of 1685, which is the founding legal document for this estate, I explained, my voice ringing with an authority that surprised even myself, defines the boundary not by a straight line, but by a line running to that tree, a tree which your surveyors in their haste failed to account for. I tapped the map decisively. This sliver of land, therefore, still belongs to Blackwood Manor, and your primary support peer, Mr. Harrison, is planned for the exact center of it. You cannot legally build your bridge. For a moment, there was complete silence, broken only by the drumming of the rain against the glass. Mr. Finch let out a short, sharp laugh. "Miss Ashworth, this is a charming piece of historical fiction. A ghost tree, a 200-year-old map drawn by some parish clerk. It's preposterous. It will not stand up in any court." But Mr. Harrison was not laughing. He had stepped forward and was leaning over the table, his eyes scanning my work with an engineer's intense, analytical gaze. He ignored the legal arguments, his attention fixed on the technical details. He pointed to a small mark on my map. "The old stone style," he murmured, almost to himself. "We use that as a benchmark for our own levels." His eyes followed my triangulation lines. He looked up at me, his expression no longer condescending, but sharp, focused, and serious. "What was your margin of error in accounting for magnetic declination since 1750? He asked. It was a test, a highly technical question designed to expose an amateur. My father and brother stared, completely lost, but I was on my own ground now. I accounted for a westward drift of approximately 1.5 degrees per century. Cross-referencing with Admiralty charts from the period, I answered calmly. I also made an allowance for the likely imprecision of the original compass used, which is why I relied on triangulation from fixed points rather than directional bearings alone. Harrison straightened up, a look of dawning comprehension on his face. He walked to the window just as he had done when he first arrived and stared out at the spot where the bridge was to be built. His shoulders sagged almost imperceptibly. He turned back to his stunned lawyers. "She's right," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion but heavy with the weight of irrefutable fact. "The pier for the viaduct, it's on her land." He looked at Mr. Finch. "The plan is unbuildable." The drawing room was plunged into a silence so profound it felt like the world had stopped turning. The pen lay untouched on the table. The surrender document lay unsigned. The rain continued to fall, but inside Blackwood Manor the storm had just broken. My father was staring at me as if he had never truly seen me before in his life. The power in the room had not just shifted, it had been completely and utterly overturned. The immediate aftermath was a flurry of hushed, frantic activity from the railway's men. Mr. Finch, his face pale with fury and embarrassment, immediately requested the use of a private room to confer with his team. As my father numbly gestured towards the library, the three men from the Great Midland Railway swept out of the drawing room, leaving a vortex of stunned silence in their wake. We were left alone, my father Thomas and me, standing around the mahogany table that was now dominated not by a legal document of surrender, but by my triumphant ink-lined maps. For a long moment nobody spoke. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the incessant tapping of the rain. My father, who had been frozen in his chair, slowly rose. He walked around the table until he was standing beside me. He didn't look at me, but at the maps, his eyes tracing the lines as if trying to decipher a language he never knew existed. He reached out a hand, hovering it over the vellum for a moment before letting it drop back to his side. "Clara," he whispered, his voice choked with an emotion I couldn't identify. He shook his head, a slow, bewildered motion. He tried to speak again, but no words came out. He simply stood there staring at my work, the work he had called doodles and fantasies, and for the first time he seemed to be seeing it for what it was, a shield that had protected them all. Thomas was the first to truly break the silence. He came to my side, his usual bluster and confidence completely gone, replaced by a quiet, genuine awe. "How?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Clara, how did you know all of this?" He wasn't questioning me, he was asking for an explanation, as a student would ask a teacher. He was seeing me not as his odd, reclusive sister, but as an expert, a person of formidable and mysterious knowledge. Before I could answer, the library door opened and the railway men returned. Their private conference had clearly been a heated one. Mr. Finch's face was a thunderous mask. "This is an ambush, Miss Ashworth," he spat, his professional veneers stripped away to reveal raw anger. "A trick. We will challenge this finding. We will bring in our own historians, our own surveyors. This is not over." But Mr. Harrison, who followed him into the room, cut him off with a calm but absolute authority. "Yes, it is, Finch," he said, his gaze fixed on me. "Stop it." He turned to his lawyer. "A legal challenge would take years and cost a fortune, and in the end we would lose. The charter is a foundational document. Her surveying is sound, the flaw is ours." Then he did something that shocked me more than anything else that day. He walked directly up to me, ignoring everyone else, and looked me in the eye. "Miss Ashworth," he said, his voice holding a tone of deep professional respect. "My compliments. That is an extraordinary piece of cartographical and historical detective work." He then turned to my father. "Mr. Ashworth, we formally withdraw our compulsory purchase order, pending a full reassessment of the entire route. Good day." And with that, they were gone. The front door closed behind them with a definitive thud, leaving victory and confusion hanging in the air. That evening, the atmosphere in the house was strange, charged with unspoken thoughts. The three of us sat in the drawing room, the decanters of brandy and sherry on the side table untouched. The victory felt too new, too fragile to celebrate. Finally, my father rose from his chair and walked over to the fireplace where I was standing. He looked at me for a long time, his eyes filled with a lifetime of misunderstanding and a dawning painful regret. He looked down at my hands, which were still faintly smudged with ink from my work. "All this time," he began, his voice thick and uneven, "all these years I believed it was just a waste, a foolishness." He struggled for the words. "I never understood. I never even tried." He took a hesitant step closer. "I am so profoundly sorry, Clara, and so very, very proud." He said the word proud as if it were a foreign object in his mouth, something he wasn't used to saying to me. But it was there, and it was real. It was the validation I had unconsciously craved my entire life, and now that I had it, I found that it was both wonderful and, surprisingly, not the most important thing in the world. Thomas, seeing the emotional weight of the moment, got up and poured 3 glasses of brandy, an honor usually reserved for himself and father. He handed one to me. He raised his own glass. "To Clara," he said, his voice clear and sincere, "the finest surveyor in the county." He meant it as a joke, a light-hearted way to break the tension, but it wasn't a joke at all. It was an apology. It was an abdication of his long-held condescension. It was a statement of profound and newly won respect. We drank in silence, the quiet toast sealing the end of the old world and the beginning of a new one within the stone walls of our home. 2 months passed. Autumn settled over the valley, painting the leaves in hues of gold and crimson. The only sign that the Great Midland Railway had ever threatened our peace was a new set of survey stakes, far in the distance on the other side of the valley, marking a new, much costlier, and far more difficult route for their line. The silence of our meadows remained unbroken by steam and iron. One afternoon, a fine carriage, far more elegant than any usually seen on our country lane, made its way up the drive. To my surprise, it was Mr. Harrison who emerged. He was not dressed as an engineer today, but as a gentleman, and he asked the maid if he might have a word with me. I received him in the small parlor, but he seemed restless, out of place. "Miss Ashworth," he said, "if I may be so bold, I wonder if I might see your workshop, your map room." I led him upstairs to my sanctuary. He stepped inside and looked around, not with the polite disinterest of my family, but with the keen eye of a fellow craftsman. He ran a hand over the surface of my drafting table, examined the instruments, and studied the maps on the wall. "This is quite the operation," he said, with genuine admiration. He told me about the fallout from our meeting. Silas Thorne had been incandescent with rage, but the engineers had stood firm. They knew they were beaten by superior data. The cost of the rerouting had been enormous, a major blow to the project's budget and timeline. Then he got to the true purpose of his visit. "The Great Midland Railway is expanding westward next year," he explained, turning to face me, "into the Pennine Hills. It is difficult, largely uncharted territory. The existing maps are unreliable at best." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "We need accurate, detailed cartography. We need someone who understands not just the lie of the land as it is, but as it was. Someone with your historical perspective and meticulous skill." He looked at me directly. "We would like to hire you, Miss Ashworth, as a paid consultant to the project." The offer struck me dumb. It was one thing to have saved my home, to have earned the long overdue respect of my family, but this was something else entirely. This was professional recognition. It was an acknowledgement of my skills on their own merits from the one man whose opinion on the matter truly counted. It was not a favor or a gesture of goodwill. It was a job offer. I accepted. My life changed completely after that day. My father, in a gesture of profound apology, had the old sewing room cleared out and converted into a proper, well-lit drafting office for me, with a new, larger table and purpose-built cabinets for my maps. He would bring visitors to the door and proudly declare, "This is my daughter Clara's office. She consults for the Great Midland Railway, you know." Thomas, before making any decision about the estate, be it purchasing a new field or planning a drainage ditch, would unroll a map and say, "Clara, what do you think? What does the land tell us?" I never married, I never had children, but I had a career, I had a purpose that extended far beyond the boundaries of our estate. My maps, born from a lonely girl's quiet obsession, helped to build a part of the country. They guided the hands of men like Mr. Harrison, ensuring that the relentless march of progress could, at the very least, be intelligent and informed. Looking back now, all those years later, I realized that the battle for Blackwood Manor was never really about the land. It was about my own place in the world. For so long, I had allowed my family's perception of me to define my own sense of self-worth. Their dismissal of my passion made me feel small, my interests frivolous. But when the crisis came, that passion wasn't frivolous at all. It was essential. It was the rock upon which the railway's ambitions broke. My family finally saw me, not for who they wanted me to be or who they thought I should be, but for exactly who I was, and it turned out the thing they saw as my greatest eccentricity was, in fact, our family's greatest strength. I learned that you cannot wait for others to give you value. Your value is inherent, contained within your unique talents and your passions, whether anyone else understands them or not. The world may call you eccentric or foolish or a waster of time, but you must never let their world become your own. So I want to leave you with this thought. Never ever let anyone tell you that your passion is pointless. You never know when the world will desperately need your particular brand of madness. Sometimes the strange, intricate map that only you know how to draw is the very one that will lead everyone else home. Have you ever had a skill or a hobby that others dismissed, only for it to become important later on? I would be so honored if you shared your own story in the comments below. It's in sharing these experiences that we realize we're not alone. If this story resonated with you, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories about finding your own strength in the most unexpected places. Sharing this with someone who might need to hear it can make all the difference. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey today. I wish you all the strength to follow your own map wherever it may lead.